Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the Polsky Center. Today's event is part of our Entrepreneurship Essentials series, and it is called Bubblegum and Duct Tape, Starting Your Venture with Low and No Cost Solutions. Our facilitator today is JC Garrett. He currently serves as the president of FarShore, which is a software agency built around startups, and now he works with Fortune 500 companies. He's also worked with over 200 startups over the last 10 years as a strategic leader with the goal of creating profitable and sustainable ventures that can grow revenue, scale operations, and raise funding. Today's presentation will be about 40 minutes long. Feel free to put any questions while JC is presenting in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. And we will get to those questions once we get to the end of the presentation. So with that, JC, I will toss it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for having me here. I'm so happy to be one of the speakers in this essential series. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and let's see if we can navigate. Second, let's try this. Share. And then I'm going to try to go full screen. Katie, can you give me a thumbs up if you see the full screen of my presentation? Perfect. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. If you're joining from Chicago, which I'm sure most of you are, I hope you're surviving the first snow flurries. Don't get too downtrodden, but you know, what better time to quarantine, I guess, than winter. So anyway, as Katie mentioned, today we're going to talk about a really interesting subject. It's something that a lot of you have probably asked yourselves. I know a lot of you have asked Katie and other folks at Polsky, and a lot of entrepreneurs that I work with or in kind of my ecosystem ask me. Which is this concept of how to kind of incrementally invest in technology and kind of what I call bubblegum and duct tape solutions, kind of temporary solutions that kind of align more with some resource realities that we face as entrepreneurs. So getting started, I'm just going to quickly kind of show you the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on my pathway to entrepreneurship and technology, A, because I like talking about myself, but more importantly, B, I want to show, as most of you will notice, I am not a coder by trade. So you'll see that my pathway to technology is probably not too dissimilar from the pathway some of you have taken. We'll go through a bit of general orienteering, kind of laying the groundwork for the topics that we're going to cover. And then really this presentation should be very practically focused. So it's about helping you identify which tools, which solutions, which bubblegum and duct tape you can consider using to actually start or scale your venture. I'll lay out some general best practices, tips, things to avoid when using these temporary solutions. I always like to, in my presentations, to offer what I call my full stack observations. That's just kind of general observations on startups relating to technology and outside of technology that I think are of note or of interest. And then we're going to save a really sufficient amount of time at the end for Q&A, because this, like most topics, is something that is really best presented with specificity to your venture. So I'll try to present everything at a bit of a high level, but we're going to allocate as much time as we possibly can at the end for everybody to be able to ask questions. And if we don't get to any, or if you think to any afterwards, I will be sharing my contact info so that you can follow up and schedule office hours time or time to connect, because I'm happy to provide that however much I can. So really quickly, just to give you some background on me, I am not a coder. I cannot stress that enough. If any of you ask me questions about how to troubleshoot whatever your application architecture problems are, I can try to give it a shot because I have been in technology for a while, but I am not a coder by trade. I am a startup consultant and startup mentor by trade, who sort of become a business technologist over the last 10 or 12 years. My professional trajectory, I graduated and started working in nonprofit management after college before I decided to embrace my capitalistic tendencies. And like a good capitalist, I decided to get an MBA. While I was getting my MBA, I sort of discovered entrepreneurship and decided to start consulting and coaching entrepreneurs on how to capitalize their ventures. So helping them create business plans, write pitch decks, develop their fundraising narrative, target the right angels and VCs to be able to capitalize and then commercialize and launch their venture. And while I was doing that for dozens of different companies, and I ran the gambit, everything from an organic fish farm in the Philippines to kind of XYZ digital company, I noticed that technology was this really recurring need and trend. And so I decided to set off to try to become a bit of a technologist myself, to be a better, more well-rounded consultant, advisor, and investor in startups. And so I moved back to Chicago after finishing up my MBA, where I led sales, strategy, and operations for a SaaS startup. And while I was there, I met my now business partner. And so for the last 12 years, we've been focused on growing our two companies, which are FarShore and Dashfire. Just really briefly, FarShore, as Katie mentioned, is a global technology agency. We've got a couple hundred full-time folks. We work with businesses at all stages, but we've primarily focused on working with early stage startups. So in and around Chicago, some groups you may be familiar with, like Pressbox, now Tide Cleaners, Farmer's Fridge, Tavala Ovens, Oars and Alps, Packback Books. The list goes on and on. We basically work with those types of companies to help them leverage and invest into technology for their venture. So whether it's mobile application technology, web application technology, leveraging digital marketing, we kind of provide the team members that they need to kind of invest and scale and grow that out. So FarShore is that technology agency. Dashfire is our advisory and our investment arm. And through those two organizations, as Katie mentioned, we've helped launch about 250 ventures to date. They've raised over $1 billion in venture capital financing, graduated from all of the top accelerators like 500 Startups, Techstars, YC, et cetera. And really industry agnostic, sector agnostic, and technology agnostic. Some of them are leveraging IoT in the healthcare space. Others are leveraging e-commerce platforms to sell their CPG products. Others are in ed tech, fintech, and anything in between. Separately from FarShore and Dashfire, I've personally worked with hundreds of other startups in a myriad of capacity. The key takeaway here is that I like to bring a backlog of experience and wisdom to kind of how I advise and mentor startups. But in particular, with my background being not exclusively in technology, or I guess not predominantly in technology, I tend to approach tech a little bit differently. I'm not here to try to convince you to become a tech purist. I'm not here to initiate you into the cult of technology. I am here as a business mentor to help you identify how to leverage technology so that you can secure and scale the fundamental operations of business, how to go out and scale operations, grow revenue, capitalize your venture, and create profitable and sustainable ventures. So again, that's kind of the starting point. That's my background. Let's talk about your background. Let's talk about your starting point, or at least I'll talk about it at a high level. I really love this quote by Howard Stevenson. I think it really encapsulates the prime directive of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. Some of you may be eye rolling, thinking, yes, clearly that is entrepreneurship. But I think it encapsulates in general the challenge that we face as entrepreneurs, but also the specific topic we're here talking about today, which are these low cost solutions for technology. So further, let's talk a little bit about these resources, and specifically, what is the critical resource of entrepreneurship? So there are a lot, right? There are a lot of resources that you as entrepreneurs either now or will be in the future contending and battling with. But the critical resource, at least in my opinion, is not capital. Some of you and a lot of you will think capitalization, fundraising, that's the critical resource that you have to contend with. It's a critical resource and it's an important resource, but in my experience, it's not the critical resource that impacts success the most, nor is it market validation. It's not going out and getting people to agree or align and say, yes, I will buy your product or buy your service, or I think this is valid in the market. The actual critical resource that you need to be contending with is time, right? Time is the thing that you need to be focused on, especially in the earlier stage of your venture, because time is the thing that will impact most of your business. It will impact it more than capital you raise, and it will impact you more than validation you get in the market. So again, as we go further into this and we think about balancing resources, when I talk about resource realities, yes, cost, yes, validation, yes, data, that's going to be important. But the primary critical resource I want you to think about when using these tools is acquiring time. That's the unit of resource I want you to focus on. So what's the primary goal of creating time for your startup? It's not to capitalize your venture, even though, again, that's important. It's not to validate your venture, it's still important. It's to learn, right? It's absolutely to go through the process of acquiring knowledge and acquiring as much knowledge as cheaply and quickly as possible. Why is learning so important for your venture, specifically in the scope of your venture? Again, it can help you raise money, but that's not why it's critically important. It's not about validating your idea. It is about one thing, and it is probably the one thing that you should be focused on as an entrepreneur, and that is creating, generating, and growing enterprise value. That's it, right? It is absolutely about creating enterprise value and driving enterprise value for your venture. So time is what allows you to acquire knowledge through learning and then investing that knowledge into generating enterprise value. That's the sequence of events that I want you guys to be thinking about and how we contextualize how to make these next investments into technology. So when you talk about technology, no matter what you're talking about, no matter what you're doing with your venture, no matter what your venture is, I want you to think about three questions. And this should be true now with where you're at in the earlier stages for most of you, but also as you get further and further along into your venture. These are three checkpoints that I want you to constantly be referencing before you make a step towards investing in technology. First, what stage is your company at? Are you purely at a conceptual or idea stage? Are you in more of kind of a pre-launch, pre-revenue validation stage? Are you in kind of that growth mode? The second I want you to think about is, what is your current technical footprint? Do you have no technical footprint right now? Are you kind of at an ideation cocktail napkin stage? Have you maybe invested in some no-code, low-code, third-party technologies? Or have you actually started developing some of the technology yourself? And then the third, and this is by far the most critical question to ask yourself at every single stage before you make any investment at all, small or large, into technology, is at this moment, am I a tech-centric or am I a tech-enabled venture? Honestly, you guys, like if you wanted like the Cliff's Notes of what's the most important thing that I think I'm going to tell you today, this is the moment where you want to listen for the next 60 seconds, because I can tell you from my experience, it's the thing that if entrepreneurs get it wrong, it is likely a reason that they will fail or struggle. And if they get it right, they have a much better chance of success. It's this tech-enabled or tech-centricity. So what does that mean? What does a tech-centric or a tech-enabled business look like? A tech-centric business is where technology is kind of your core investable asset. It is the thing that either directly or predominantly encompasses that enterprise value, that EV that you're trying to build, right? I'm sure a lot of you could think of a million different examples of companies where their core investable asset is the technology itself. Usually, if you are a tech-centric business, you are going to need to leverage mostly customized and custom-built solutions. The critical pathway for a tech-centric business is about identifying what those custom core features are, and more importantly, what leadership or technical human capital you need to expand and build out those features. This is going to be something that will be more inclined towards prototyping and less inclined towards bubblegum and duct tape or temporary solutions. And then it's going to be more expensive up front. It's going to be more technically defensible over the long term, but you will have fewer kind of temporary solution options available to you if you are a more tech-centric business. If you're more of a tech-enabled business, which, by the way, in my experience, most people tend to think they are tech-centric when in fact they are very much tech-enabled or more tech-enabled than they think. That's where technology is primarily a functional tool. It's not the investable asset. It's not the enterprise value of your venture. It's when you use technology to acquire, drive, or scale the acquisition of your enterprise value. It can be custom built, but more often, especially early on, it can leverage these temporary solutions or open source solutions. The critical pathway for you is balancing technical needs and business needs or business priorities. And again, it's particularly important to focus on finding resources, tools, and partnerships that can directly leverage experience or existing functionality or existing exposure to get you the functionality that you want. It's more immediately affordable. It's less technically defensible early on, but you have a lot more temporary and non-temporary solutions available to you. So again, the key takeaway here, everybody, is of the three questions before you invest in any technology at any stage of your venture, you need to constantly be asking yourself, am I tech-centric or am I tech-enabled? Now, the truth is it's usually not a binary decision. It's not, okay, I am definitely tech-centric or I am definitely tech-enabled. It's somewhere on a scale, but I think most of you will end up being more tech-enabled than you actually realize. This is a very powerful and a very important takeaway. So I'd like to stress it. It's something I've been evangelizing my entire career. I'm a technologist who's made his entire career convincing people that they are not as leveraged in technology as they maybe think they are. So anyway, so we talk about
I just want to
leveraging.
jump in really quickly because there were two questions in the chat asking if you could just give some examples of tech-enabled and tech-centric companies.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So a tech-centric company would be a company like Facebook, right? The core investable asset that they have is predominantly in the technology, or, you know, Instagram, right? Yeah, I mean, you can maybe argue and split off in some ways that part of the investable asset or the enterprise value of some of those ventures is the brand, or maybe it's the content that they've aggregated. But the truth of the matter is that the investable asset, the enterprise value that's really driving their venture is the technology itself. You know, other examples would be, you know, people who are leveraging devices in the IoT space, like we're all familiar with Uptake here in Chicago. You know, again, another example of somebody who's heavily invested in the enterprise value of their venture being containerized within the technology. Tech-enabled ventures would be, think about any business that's leveraging Shopify or Magento, or they're selling their product online, right? Their actual enterprise value is the product itself that they're selling, or the brand that they're building. The technology that they are leveraging is not the investable asset, meaning it's not the reason they have enterprise value. It's just helping them acquire that enterprise value. So they can put this product online, they can sell it, they can acquire that enterprise value by selling it. So again, think of an e-commerce company as a tech-enabled business, and think of your more tech-centric business as somebody who's creating a figurative or maybe literal digital cure to cancer. But that's a great question.
JC,
okay.
Shanna wanted to know, are
Sure.
all mobile app businesses therefore tech-centric?
No, they absolutely are not. No, I would say, in fact, most mobile app businesses are more tech-enabled than they would imagine. The platform itself, like what you're investing in, whether it's web or mobile technology, does not necessarily denote whether or not you are tech-enabled or tech-centric. And again, it's a little bit of a splitting hair, you know, kind of analysis, because it's usually not in absolute terms one way or the other. And that's why, honestly, you constantly have to revisit those three questions. Those three questions at various, you know, cycles of your venture will change over time. And the mixture of tech centricity and tech enablement is almost going to boil down to a feature to feature specific basis. You know, there will be certain features where you are needing to invest in the technology because it is part of your enterprise value. So think about a platform that leverages artificial intelligence, or maybe data science, machine learning, right? The tool that you use to aggregate that data, like a survey tool or a chat tool, that can be tech enabled, right? You don't have to create, in order to collect information, you don't have to actually have that piece of it be tech centric. So you can use open source services, you can use third-party technology, but the data computing side, the machine learning, the NLP, all of the fancy stuff on the back end that's happening, that piece you probably will have to have more tech centricity towards. So even within one ecosystem of a technology piece, you can have certain parts that are more tech enabled and certain parts that are more tech centric. And so that's why constantly revisiting those three questions is important. But no, not just because it's mobile or not mobile, web or not web, machine learning or not machine learning, doesn't necessarily denote it is tech centric or it is tech enabled. So that's why you have to constantly be asking those questions at various cycles. It's a great question. Okay, so going back to talking about generating enterprise value, right? So the question becomes, okay, we need technology. We all know technology can help us generate enterprise value. It can help us scale, automate, grow. How do you do that, though, when you have limited resources? And again, limited resources being time or money and or validation. In reality, there are three options you can contend with early in the company, right? First is prototyping. So prototyping, a lot of you are familiar with this. A lot of you heard of like MVP, minimum viable product. That falls on the scale of what we would consider to be prototyping. That is a low cost technology investment solution. So, but it can range from just generating general wireframes all the way to a fully versioned release. This can be a more resource intensive, kind of pathway, but it is more scalable, certainly more defensible, and it has a much broader use of application. So you can do a lot more with a prototype than you generally can with the second category. The second category being some form of a temporary solution, or what I like to call bubblegum and duct tape, right? Bubblegum and duct tape, it's where you're leveraging an existing solution, something that's already out there to meet a specific functional need, right? So you want to try to, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, but you want to try to limit those needs as much as possible. So bubblegum and duct tape should not try to do 1,000 different things. It should do one thing or maybe two things at most. It's much less resource intensive, much less time and money up front. There's much less scalability, and there's a lot narrower use or kind of application of what you could do. The third option, by the way, and it's always an option to be aware of, is do nothing. Obviously, I'm not going to give a presentation on how to do nothing. I think I'll probably figure that out. Just don't make the investment. But typically, if you have limited resources and you can't make the full investment into technology now or in the future with your venture, prototyping and these bubblegum and duct tape temporary solutions are the two pathways you want to consider most. So let's talk a little bit more about prototyping. When is prototyping a more possible, plausible, advisable pathway to consider? Well, obviously, number one, you probably have more resources at your disposal. Now, it doesn't mean that you have an infinite number of resources, because at every stage of entrepreneurship, again, Howard Stevenson, it's about managing opportunity or pursuing opportunity without all of the resources you need. But you probably have more resources. You probably have a little more time and a little more budget at your disposal. It's where you want to be focusing on managing or scaling several functions at one time, not just one or two things. A prototype is best used for testing, pre-selling, maybe presenting your vision to a multitude of stakeholders. So this could be internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, could be your partners, could be potential investors. That's where you want to kind of be more advised towards a prototype pathway. You can use it to create insights on design, functionalities, and just making your product development process more efficient and effective. It's a really great risk mitigation tool. So if you find yourself as a more tech-centric business, or just in general needing to make an investment, but you can't leverage an existing piece of technology, use a prototype to maximize your risk mitigation for your eventual full investment into technology. And it's also, again, a prototype is more useful for generating capitalization momentum. So that can be generating revenue with your end customer, or showing something to a potential investor, gaining that momentum so that they'll actually write you a check. Where it's more less possible, more challenging, kind of ill-advised to use a prototype is when you don't have the requisite resources, more specifically time and money available. It's when you have an inexperienced product manager or prototype manager orchestrating the process, and that includes yourself. It's important to kind of self-assess and be self-aware of what it is that you're able to do. Doesn't mean it's impossible for you to pick this up and manage a prototyping stage on your own. It just means that if you don't have experience doing it, it can be more challenging. And then the last, most critical piece is you don't want to prototype if your functional needs are not fully clarified and if you don't understand. If there's any ambiguity, or if there's a lot of ambiguity on what it is you functionally need, don't start investing into a prototype, right? You definitely want to try to explore not investing or use an open source or bubblegum and duct tape temporary solution. So let's talk about bubblegum and duct tape. When it's more advisable to use these types of temporary solutions is when you're kind of more aligned with a stricter resource reality, when you're really compelled by time and budget availability, you have no money, literally no money available, or you need something turned around very quickly. That's when you're typically going to gravitate towards more of these temporary existing solutions. It's when you're trying to scale or automate one singular function, not multiple functions. And also, this is really important, it's when you also have identified an on-ramp to what your more scalable solution will be, all right? And I'll talk more about this in a bit, but it's hard enough to be successful as an entrepreneur. Don't let failure be the thing that kills you, or don't let success be the thing that makes failure happen, right? Like don't generate enough scale and enough sales and enough interest that using this temporary solution is actually the thing that kills you. So anyway, where it's more challenging or ill-advised to use these temporary solutions is when the feature or the function that you're building is acting as the core interaction of your business. So think about it like the closer you get to your end customer with this tool, the more ill-advised it is to use temporary solutions. Doesn't mean that there's not solutions that you can use, but just kind of as a general yellow flag metric, the more internally facing it is, the more advised it is, the more externally facing it is, the more you want to be cautious. If you're trying to achieve too many functional outputs from one platform, you want to stay away from these temporary solutions. If you're trying to validate product market fit, I get this all the time. People come to me and say, I want to validate product market fit, and I'm going to use Google Sheets and Sheety API, and I'm going to, and that's, I didn't curse, that's a thing I'll talk about in a second. That's a platform. They want to leverage Drift and all of these other tools, and that's great, but you're not really validating whether your product fits in the market, because that's not your product, right? So again, it's difficult to validate product market fit without actually having your product in some form out there. It's not great for generating momentum for investors. You know, again, most investors are not going to get super excited and thrilled by you leveraging these resources. They'll kind of applaud your ingenuity and your kind of ability to execute, but that's only going to take you so far. They're not going to be compelled to want to write a check because you've got some temporary solution. They may be willing to invest despite that, but they usually aren't going to invest just because of that. And then again, if you're trying to validate an extension of an existing product line, not so advisable. And if you want it to act as a permanent or semi-permanent solution, definitely not advisable. So this is the nitty gritty, right? This is where we've got it at a high level. Now we're going to get very, very practical. Now we're going to talk about very specific tools that over the last dozen years, when entrepreneurs have said, okay, JC, I want to build a prototype. I want to use bubblegum and duct tape to launch my venture. What are the specific platforms you recommend? So we're going to talk about very specific ones that you guys can consider using across a myriad of topics. So we'll start with prototyping. I'm not going to go too far into this because most of you right now are probably familiar with some of these concepts, but I have gone through, these are kind of the 6 main prototyping types that you can gravitate towards. And I've starred or put an asterisk next to the ones that are lower cost or nowhere cost. That's a word? No, low cost, no cost. So wireframes and requirements documentation, you know, this is where you want to create a rough sketch or an overview of the product that you want to build. You can do your technical research, kind of document it. It's really good for non-customer stakeholders, technology partners, your other founders. It's a great segue into making that, again, eventual investment into technology, like we were talking about before. Then there are stylized demos. This is where you can actually go through and use tools to create a branded, stylized solution, kind of create the facsimile of what a user experience would look like. It can tell a much more detailed, kind of user story narrative. Really good for generating pre-sales from potential customers or having a deeper customer user validation conversation, and also generating excitement with potential investors. Fully stylized, has all of the look and feel of what your application will look like. A proof of concept prototype, this is where there is a coding dependency, but this is where you have a critical feature, like one critical thing that you have to figure out if it's even technically feasible to do it. And so rather than developing the entirety of your prototype or the entirety of the platform, you develop this one key feature and test whether or not this concept can be proven to be able to work. Again, another really good risk arbitrator for making the future investment into technology. And then the last piece that I'm sure all of you at this point are familiar with, thank you, Eric Rees from the Lean Startup MVP, minimum viable product, right? This is where you have a more representatively complete set of features. And again, they're minimally viable. So it's not everything that you would ever want it to do. There's usually some coding and investment involved, but the main goal here is to kind of rapidly learn and redeploy as you learn over time. And again, it's good for pursuing capitalization and gathering pivot plots, identifying segmenting opportunities, et cetera. So those are the 4 more common kind of lower cost, or in some cases, no cost solutions for prototyping that you'll want to gravitate towards, especially, kind of earlier on. Bubblegum and duct tape. So here are some specific solutions. I'm not going to go through all of these, don't worry. But these are specific tools. And by the way, I think Katie is going to send a follow-up breaking this down. So you'll have this list as well as a more comprehensive list or compendium that I've put together over the years of, okay, if you want to do surveying, here are the tools that I think work well. If you want to manage your business process better, here are the tools I think work well, et cetera. But I do want to comment on kind of these 6 main areas and a couple tools specifically, just to give you a flavor. So commonly, surveying and communication with your customer or with other stakeholders is a key area that people want to gravitate towards. JotForm is a really great tool if you're kind of tired of the survey monkey feel, which is a great tool as well, in my opinion, because it's highly integratable, but JotForm is something I definitely recommend. Firebase is really user-friendly for you to be able to build out a platform to enable mobile text and push notifications on your own. And then Klaviyo, this is an awesome tool for non-technical founders to use to actually enable retargeting and user segmentation, particularly on your website. So if you're driving traffic to your website, whether it's B2B or B2C sales, and you're trying to retarget people who have come, Klaviyo or Klaviyo, depending on how you want to pronounce it, it's a really excellent dashboard to be able to create different user cohorts and subsegments and manage a drip campaign to each of them. And you can do all of these, by the way, all of these tools. Let me just make sure all of these tools require zero coding. Like, you don't have to code anything. You don't need to know any coding. You can literally sign up for these platforms. Most of them are free, and start using them more or less immediately. So again, Klaviyo is a really good tool. Designing, branding wireframes. A lot of you are probably familiar with either InVision or Marvel, really good coding platform or non-coded platform to be able to present screens. Balsamiq, if you're looking to build out wireframes, I strongly suggest Balsamiq. Very easy to use, drag and drop, user friendly. GIMP is another really good tool to be able to manipulate and manage design files on your own. Basically, GIMP allows you to be a designer, graphic designer in some small aspect. My graphic design team would kill me for saying this, but it's a way for you to manage design files on your own and kind of edit and manage those more manual without being a designer. Business process and management. If this, then that. IFTTT, like, this is an awesome tool. If you guys aren't familiar with this, just go and check it out. It's a way for you to create and manage conditional statements on a backend system. So kind of basically a whole bunch of if this, then that statements to kind of manage database sheets and things like that. Really great tool. Very user-friendly, can't recommend it enough. Smartsheet, similarly, is another great back-end tool. But again, Google Drive, Dropbox, Coda, these are all tools I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but these are really great for managing business processes. Website e-commerce. Again, most of you have probably heard of these. I just want to call out specifically that as far as like a best in class, kind of get it off the ground yourself, because a lot of people, some of you may want to be building out e-commerce. The best singular solution that I would start with is Shopify. Now, Square is going to be a little bit easier for you to get up and running on your own. The reason I recommend Shopify is Shopify has the most longevity. We've been able to see Shopify go from pre-revenue companies generating to 9 figures in annual revenue and all the way past acquisition. So, to whatever extent you can invest in a platform now that you never need to switch off of, Square will probably only take you so far. Wix certainly will only take you so far. But Shopify is a platform. If you one of my like singular e-commerce recommendation, I would say Shopify would be the one to stick with. But all of these others are totally viable as well, both as payment processors and as e-commerce platforms. Data collection and modeling. Sheedy API is another really cool tool. This is something where you can take your online, you can take your Google Docs, you can take your Excel file databases, anything that you've created, Airtable even, and you can turn it into something integratable. So you can basically, like, if you have customers who want to integrate with your data source that you've been managing through Google Docs, you can use Sheedy API to be able to turn that Google Doc into an integratable asset, have kind of an API into your documentation. So it's a really cool way to kind of basically take an existing backend database on Google and turn it into something that's open for other people to consume, their customers, etc. And then Mechanical Turk, and again, just a really cool service available by Amazon. So what Mechanical Turk is, if you're not familiar, it's basically a program. You can create an assignment and it will kind of crowdsource it out all across the world for data collection. So if you don't want to create crawlers to crawl content from certain websites, let's say you're in data discovery mode and you're trying to collect information from 300 different websites. It could be about fundraising. It could be about anything else. And you don't want to manually do that yourself or have an intern do it. Mechanical Turk, you can basically set a daily budget or a task budget for pennies per entry. And they'll go out and crowdsource this information all across the globe and have it completed. You can set a daily budget and not to exceed. Mechanical Turk is a really, really powerful tool. So kind of instead of investing in one of these platforms, if you just don't want to have to automate or manually do things yourself, you want to automate the manualization of something, Mechanical Turk is the way to go. It's a really cool platform. Two more, and just in the general category, SpyFu is a great platform to sign up for if you want to do some competitive research. So you don't want to pay a company like mine to necessarily go out and research your competitor as far as their digital marketing footprint, their SEO, what AdWords they're associating with, what campaigns they're running right now. SpyFu is a really great platform, and there should be, I think it's still a free trial period you can use for most of the reports for a while. And then again, FarShore, Zapier, Bubble. A lot of you are probably hearing a lot about Bubble right now. It's not a platform I've used myself, but it does seem to be a platform that people are able to use. One thing I would caution about platforms like these is they do seem to come and go. And so one of the challenges can be, again, is that, Bubble has the optics of being something that could be around longer than it is. And I'm not saying Bubble's going to go away necessarily, but as far as their user license agreement and kind of the free model or kind of which pay model you need to go with, I think you'll very quickly be finding yourself potentially using one of the paid versions in order to get what you want, which still may be more cost and time effective than building it out. But Bubble's something to be aware of. It's definitely something to check out. But again, it's not something that I've used personally. So anyway, all of these tools and tons more are available, but this gives you just at least a little bit of a sense of what's available and out there. The key thing, though, is, and the key takeaway from this slide is, you don't want a tool that does 5 things. Your JotForm or your Firebase or your Klaviyo is not also going to manage and allow you to turn your backend Google Doc into an API, right? So you need one tool for one function, a one-to-one, as much as you can. Don't try to take one tool and make it do 5 different things, because that pathway will eventually lead to failure. So if you want to use bubblegum and duct tape, try to do a one-to-one. I need one piece of functionality. I'm going to have this one platform do it. So anyway, okay, so we're getting towards the end. Now we're just going to talk about some best practices when it comes to using these temporary solutions, this bubblegum and duct tape, just things to be aware of in general, regardless of which you choose. Like I said earlier, be careful when you're using temporary solutions. Don't let success be the thing that kills your venture. Like it's hard enough to succeed. And I hope I'm not the first person to tell you this. I'm sure you all realize this. Statistically speaking, you're all supposed to fail, right? And maybe not fail, but not become a unicorn, right? And so it's hard enough. There's a lot of reasons you can fail, but don't let success be the reason you fail. And so using these temporary solutions, that can become true. It's like you can actually generate so much interest and so much volume of interest and so much volume of inbound kind of optics that it's actually the thing that kills your business. It ruins your brand, it ruins your ability to scale, ruins your momentum. So be careful when leveraging these technologies. Definitely create an off-ramp or have an off-ramp in mind for where you take this temporary solution once you reach a certain threshold. Because otherwise, if you don't have that in mind, you're not planning for success. And if you're not planning for success, you may not reach it, but even if you do, you're probably going to fail anyway. So have an off-ramp in mind of when you're going to get off of these solutions onto a more scalable solution. Like, prioritize as few functions as possible. Again, one-to-one. If you need a piece of functionality, have one platform that does that thing, and that's it. Don't try to make that platform do 12 things. Get another platform that does that thing. The closer to generating revenue or the closer to your customer, the less compelling bubblegum and duct tape should be for you. If it's more of an internally facing kind of operational stakeholder or internal employee stakeholder, facing tool, that should be more compelling. Internal stakeholders, again, best targets for these types of tools. Focusing on one stakeholder at a time. So don't choose one of these tools or one of these platforms thinking, okay, well, it's going to do this for my employees and it's going to do this for an investor and it's going to do this for my customer. No, one function, one stakeholder. That's it. That's the best, most scalable way to do this, right? To de-risk your position. When you start compounding it with multiple people, A, it's unlikely that that tool is going to be able to do everything for those users that you want them to do. And B, you're going to get caught up in figuring out, well, which tool is best for this purpose. So one tool, one stakeholder, keep it simple as much as possible. Avoid corner case pitfalls. So the other thing about using bubblegum and duct tape is that you will not be able to satisfy all of the scenarios, right? There will be times, there will be situations where a more manualized or kind of redundant effort process is going to be put in place. It's unlikely that any of these tools are going to be able to do everything that you need them to do. So avoid getting caught in a corner case scenario. Let it take care of the 80% of the usability that you're looking for, and then manage the 10 to 20% that remains more manually. Don't try to make it a fully 100% efficient and effective process. If you're fundraising, you can use bubblegum and duct tape to test a hypothesis or dimensionalize your unit economics, but not scale them, right? So again, a lot of times if you're talking about interfacing with an investor, you're trying to show them these numbers. So maybe you're trying to create some idea of what your actual CAC and LTV are, or you're trying to test a certain hypothesis in the market. So you can kind of qualitatively test those things or dimensionalize those things, but you can't really quantitatively drive those things. So again, there's a lack of scale there. So kind of get the initial information that you need, and then let that be that. And then this is probably the most important thing. When you're leveraging bubblegum and duct tape, build out a list of goals and non-goals. What do I mean by that? If you're using these tools, know what you're using them for, but also know what you're not using them for. And this will be critical as you create that off-ramp to whatever the next piece of technology is. Make sure that you understand this tool that I am using. If you're using Firebase, if you're using if this then that, if you're using Sheety API, this is the reason that you're using it, and here are the reasons you are not using it. Because I can promise you, when you get into the mix of it, and when you're kind of dealing with 1,000 other things at once, you'll try to think to yourself, well, maybe I can use this tool for that purpose. Again, no, give yourself early on as you're planning a clear list of goals and non-goals of what you're going to do to use these temporary solutions. And if you do these things, you'll have the most chance of success in using them. Not a guaranteed level of success, but the most chance. You're de-risking the risk they represent, leveraging them into your venture. Okay, so those are the general best practices for bubblegum and duct tape. Last slide before we get to questions. Okay. I always like to include some observations that I have as what I call a full stack mentor. What is a full stack mentor, by the way? It's just somebody who will observe, mentor, and advise on all facets of startup operations. So obviously my background is more in fundraising, go-to-market strategy, and technology, but I tend to comment, advise, guide, and offer input on everything from product development, branding, marketing and sales, legal. Don't count anything as legal advice legally, I guess, but I mean, I'll comment on it at least. So this slide is really just kind of a dozen or so, no, 12 observations that I've had that I like to share. And I'll just kind of quickly go through them because I think people find them of value, both including bubblegum and duct tape and just kind of outside of this topic as well. Again, time is the primary resource you need, not money. If money was all startup needed to be successful, a lot of startups would be funded, right? If all I needed to give you was $50 million for your startup and your venture to be successful, to reach billion-dollar unicorn status, I guarantee you'd find somebody to give you $50 million. But that's not the thing that decides whether or not your startup will be successful. But if I gave you 50 years, if I gave you 50 years of focusing on your venture, on your market, on your problem, I guarantee you could solve it perfectly. And that's why time is more important than money. Time is the thing that will help you achieve what you want to achieve. So don't get caught up in kind of the quagmire of saying, well, I've got to go out and capitalize and I've got to go out and fundraise. Yes, you have to do those things, but it's really more about buying yourself time. Speaking of capitalization, you want to capitalize your venture, don't just target fundraising. Again, it's like a false equivalency with a lot of entrepreneurs at this early stage. They think, I got to go fundraise, I got to go fundraise, I got to go fundraise. And I get it. You got to fundraise to invest in your venture. But what good is raising the first round if you can't raise your last round, right? Like you as an entrepreneur, and you can see here number 12, you are also an investor. Right? An opportunity cost investor, a lot of you invest in capital. What good is raising your first round now if you can't raise the last round you need to exit? So think of fundraising as a vein of capitalization, but capitalization can also include non-dilutable activities like generating revenue, generating grants, etc. Next up, no startup has ever failed according to an Excel projection. I've seen thousands of financial projections over the years, and I've never seen somebody tell me, and then in year 5, our startup fails. So don't get too caught up in preparing financial projections because we all understand it's CEO math. You want to prioritize momentum, not achievement, both inside your product development pathway and outside of your product development pathway, especially true if you're fundraising. So a rational investor is not going to be interested in what you've achieved. they're going to be interested in what you've done to generate momentum. So it's not about where you're at, it's about what you've done and how that projects to where you're going. Many startups get the tech-centric, tech-enabled question wrong. Don't be one of them. Entrepreneurs wear many hats. The more successful entrepreneurs tend to figure out the right order in which to take off those hats. So kind of if you have all of the jobs today, know which jobs you want to fire yourself from early on. Typically, I recommend firing yourself from being the product manager early on if you're a non-technical founder especially. Technology is truthfully more likely to be the reason that your business fails than the reason it succeeds. Why is this important is because I think you need to approach your technology investment in most cases as a risk mitigator and then trying to turn it into a leverageable asset. So don't let technology be the reason your venture is held back. Maybe eventually you can turn it into the thing that's helping you kind of propel your venture forward, but don't make it the thing that makes it the reason that you fail. The number one reason startups fail is the founder quits. Sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't think about that. Most common variable of highly successful entrepreneurs being full-time. That's more important than education, more important than gender, more important than entrepreneur experience. Full-time entrepreneurs do better. So if you're not full-time yet, give yourself a pathway to getting there. But definitely at some point being full-time is critical. More startups struggle because of overspending on marketing rather than underspending. Fewer people than you hope will transfer over to your VEEP 1.0 paid release. So as you're using these temporary solutions, as you're going through this process, you're going to get people who tell you, yeah, I would definitely pay for that. Yeah, I would love to be a part of that. And then when it comes time to actually sign them up and get them signed on, fewer than you hope will do that. And that's okay. So again, don't freak out if that happens. Just kind of a general observation to be aware of. So those are the general observations. We'll open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, JC. I really appreciate those words of wisdom, and some of these resources I'm familiar with, but others I have never heard of before. So I really appreciate you sharing those with us. Question in the chat regarding your list of resources. There were certain ones that were bolded, and what was the reason for that?
Just specifically to make sure I talk about them. Just kind of reminding myself.
Got
yeah,
it.
just no. I mean, they're cool resources, so they're bolded because, like, in particular, I think more people don't know about them or should know about them. But no, I just bolded the ones that I wanted to kind of touch on more than the others.
Perfect. And then someone else was wondering, where would you put SendGrid in those 6 different buckets?
I don't know that I'm familiar with SendGrid. I'd have to do a little bit of research into that. So general would be my answer, I guess. But I guess, yeah, I'd have to take a little bit of a look at it. But it doesn't really matter where they go into the buckets. It's not about so much categorizing them as it is the key takeaway is giving yourself one functional tool. So a lot of these platforms, and I'm sure SendGrid is the same, has a multitude of purposes. You do not want to leverage bubblegum and duct tape for a multitude of purposes. You want to leverage one platform for one purpose, or maybe 2 purposes, but you don't want to let it do everything. So more importantly than categorizing it as a document management tool, a business process tool, a survey communication tool, what's more important is that you define it as one functional thing or 2 functional things, and that's what it is. Don't try to make it also 9 other things, even if the platform offers it.
Great. Another question in the chat, is Google Firebase just a mobile app prototyping platform or an actual development platform?
So you can leverage Firebase, but the answer is both. It can actually be both. So you can actually leverage Firebase to be able to go out and manage communication, and it could also be a platform on which you can develop on top of it. It started off as the latter and is kind of, or the former, and has evolved into the latter over time.
Okay. Shanna's wondering, you mentioned the longevity of Shopify. So would you say that's okay to use some of these bubblegum and duct tape solutions even into the prototyping and launch phases?
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, some of these tools are, and how you apply them, like they could be bubblegum and duct tape, but they could eventually kind of become a bit of a prototype as well. The idea behind, especially a platform like an open source platform like Shopify, is that if you're leveraging it yourself, meaning you don't have experience building and launching a Shopify site, then you're probably using it more bubblegum and duct tape, because the scope of the features that are natively available in the harness of these platforms, you're not as familiar with. So even though it's kind of like it's a hammer, but in one set of hands it's used in one way, and another set of hands it's used in another. You as a non e-commerce web store expert probably won't be able to get the full functionality of Shopify, but using bubblegum and duct tape Shopify yourself now, and then eventually onboarding that person or those people who can do it, they'll be able to use that same tool in a much more scalable way.
This is just my personal question that came up as you were talking, but how do you determine the that point when you want that off ramp of, we were using this bubblegum and duct tape solution and now we're ready for something else? So how do you determine when you're actually like at that stage when it's time to move on and use a different system?
Yeah, it's a great question. Usually the truth of the matter is that you want to get off of it as quickly as possible. So like I could probably outline like a decision matrix of, here's kind of the exigent environmental, situation from number of users and traction with your business, where it's like you should feel more inclined. But here's the best guiding post ever. It's like, when do you drink more water? When you're thirsty, I guess. Like, when do you get off of this platform? As soon as you have the money and the resources to be able to get off. Because it's a liability, and all technology is a liability, but especially bubblegum and duct tape. So I would say that as soon as you are in a position to be able to invest the time and the assets into getting off of the platform, that is when you want to start making that step. Now, the bigger question will be like, how quickly, like, do you need to completely off ramp off of it, or can you have kind of a phased off ramp? Depending on how your business is performing, depending on that trajectory, that scalability, et cetera. That would be something to look at. But the shortest answer, the easiest answer is, as soon as you have the resources, time and money or skill available, that's when you should start executing that off ramp.
That makes a lot of sense. Question from Christian in the chat. What do you think of ShareTribe to prototype / build a two-sided marketplace?
ShareDrive? Not familiar.
ShareTribe.
ShareTribe, nope, not or ShareTribe. I'm honestly not familiar with that platform as well, but that's great. This is how the compendium is built, by the way, everybody. Everybody tells me like, hey, what do you think about this? And I go, well, let me research it. So whoever's asking these questions about ShareTribe or anybody else, you'll see here in a minute, I'll give you my contact info. If you want to follow up, I will do a little bit of research into these platforms. And if you just reach out and say, hey, I'm the one who asked about that question, I'll give you kind of my specific commentary on any of these.
Perfect. What if there is a critical technology missing for the proposed solution for the startup? How would a founder acquire that technology?
Critical technology missing. So I'm going to assume in that scenario, what they're saying is like the technology doesn't exist. Like not that it's missing from their current architecture, that like it's missing from the world, kind of a thing. I'm going to assume that's the direction they're going. Like what they need the technology to do hasn't been done. Like they're really blazing some sort of a trail digitally. If that's the case, then that piece of your business falls more into tech centricity. So tech centricity at that point is you're not going to be able to leverage an existing technology or an existing assets experience, a person or a team's experience. You need to go out and find the person who can build that experience. So again, that's where it's important to isolate what parts of your architecture are tech enabled and what parts are tech centric. And if that piece of it doesn't exist, if there's not something in the marketplace, then A, you're probably going to develop a prototype, like a proof of concept, and B, you need to go out and find the person or the team that has the requisite skill, maybe not experience, but the requisite skill and knowledge to be able to execute that prototype.
Okay. 2 questions in the chat that I think I'm going to combine. Someone is wondering, how do you view the practice of hiring interns without a salary? I'm asking because minimum wage in Chicago of $13 an hour could be a lot for a startup. And as a follow-up to that, how do you protect your startup's IP when you're using contractors or interns? So I'm thinking maybe this is a broader question of bubblegum and duct tape solutions for either human resource or legal functions.
Sure. Wow, I knew as soon as I said legal, I knew somebody was going to ask a legal question. So, okay, caveats. I took 1 full semester of business law in B school, so like I'm pretty equipped to handle all of these questions. No, talk to an attorney. I am not an attorney. This does not constitute legal advice. whatever the caveats are, I've now said them, it's on recording. My functional experience would relate to this. Number one, I would not hire an intern to specifically build out or code something. If you're going to make that investment, I would make that investment fully, or I would try to find a temporary bubblegum and duct tape solution. Middling that kind of, okay, well, we're going to invest in a prototype, but not really invest in a prototype. I would try to break out functionally what you would have that intern be doing and really list all of those features and deliverables and then prioritize the most important ones. And maybe there are certain ones that the intern wouldn't need to do so that you could leverage bubblegum and duct tape, you could leverage an existing solution. And then maybe there are others that you could just kind of piecemeal together from a more experienced person. So not that I'm anti-intern or anything like that, but typically in my experience, hiring an intern to build out the initial version of your product. Now, if you've got an existing product team, if you've got technology leadership, if you've got infrastructure, this is a completely different scenario, right? Then interns are highly effective in that way. But if it's just you, especially as a non or less technical founder saying, I'm going to go and hire an intern to do this, I think you're going to have a really challenging time being able to do it. So what I would do is I would first say, rather than worrying about whether or not to pay an intern or what to pay an intern, I would say, take the pieces that you would have that intern team delivering and developing, prioritize those, see if you can functionally assign some of those features to bubblegum and duct tape. And then the rest, I would make an incremental investment into a prototype with a more experienced person. So that way they don't have to do everything kind of the list of 1 through 5, but maybe you have that other person doing number 1 and number 3. And then as far as protecting your IP, again, same caveats, I'm not an attorney, blah, 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 blah. Here's the truth of the matter, okay? Yes, you want to make sure that you have IP ownership very clear in the contract agreement, right? And there's tons of sources out there. You want to make sure that they know that all of the work product that they produce on your project, whether it's a contractor, an intern, or anybody else, is exclusively owned by your company, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, though, if you're talking about like investing in IP rights or IP ownership, generally speaking, there's not a lot from a developmental standpoint or a software development standpoint that you're going to be able to successfully capture IP around. Functionally, strategically, I would say this. Filing for a patent or going through the patent process is good for investment purposes, not because it gives you a tangible asset, although it does do that, but it more so shows investors that you're not infringing upon someone else's patent, right? So like when people ask me like, JC, do most of your companies go through that process? The answer is not usually. And if they do, it's more to clarify that they've got room in the market versus creating a wall between them and someone else. I mean, anybody can steal your idea. A patent or a contract is only as good as the person who's kind of executing it and kind of their intentions. And so your goal is just to, number one, only work with people that you feel like you have a higher degree of trust with. But number two, do everything you can to reasonably protect yourself with kind of a base level IP ownership contract. But you definitely want that in place with anybody who touches your code base. You want to make sure with absolute clarity and unambiguous terms that you own that work product, down to the email, down to the documents, down to the code itself. That should all be very, very clear in an employment agreement or a contractor's agreement.
Thank you for that explanation, JC. And a resource that I do want to mention for those that are based in Chicago is the Innovation Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. Startups can apply to receive legal guidance from current law school students. So that's a resource that I recommend using if you're interested in the legal aspects of the startup realm. I believe we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions, so feel free to keep putting those in the chat. But there is a question about, is there anything that is a true dynamic cart that's built on Shopify for any industry that anyone is aware of?
A true dynamic cart? I need to know a little more information about it. So, I mean, Shopify itself is a cart. So, yeah, I would need to know, whoever asked that question, I'm just going to go ahead and pop this up just while we're talking through the rest. Send me an email and clarify for me what you're looking for as far as dynamicism, and I can probably direct you towards a specific plugin. And if not, I'll just ask the head of our Shopify team what he says.
Great. Thank you, JC. It's a little after 1 p.m. here in Chicago, and it looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat. So first of all, I would like to thank JC for sharing his time and expertise with us. This recording will be sent out along with the slides, so you can reference all the recommendations JC made here. And then his email address is there also if you'd like to contact him. Next week, our next webinar in the Entrepreneurship Essentials series is going to be next Monday, and it's going to be about fundraising for your startup, and I'll include a link to sign up for that as well. So thank you again, JC, for being here. Thank you to all of you who participated and viewed at home, and we will see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for having me, and thanks everybody for joining, and best of luck with your venture. Please feel free to reach out if I can help in any way.
Thanks, JC. Have a good day, everyone.